Hi, I'm Dr. Gerard Guillory with the CARE Group in Denver, Colorado. I've got some important messages for you today. Today we're going to talk about the role of inflammation in disease. The way I want you to think about this is this way. Every one of us has a biological clock, and that clock is ticking, and that determines how fast we're aging. Some of us are aging faster than others. The thing that determines how fast your biological clock is ticking is actually the degree of cellular inflammation that we all have. You can actually measure the degree of cellular inflammation through blood tests. You may have heard of the cardiac CRP or the highly selective CRP. It's a very sensitive measure of inflammation, which is an independent risk factor for heart disease. So in other words, independent of cholesterol and all the other known risk factors for a heart attack, if your cardiac CRP is elevated, that means that you're at increased risk of having a premature heart attack. But not only that, you're at an increased risk of dying of many of the other age-related disorders, and everything that you can do to decrease cellular inflammation will help to slow down your biological clock. Another way to think about it is that's anti-aging, and you're hearing a lot about anti-aging medicine. So let's talk about those factors that determine cellular inflammation and what you can do to change those. There are a lot of environmental factors. For example, smoking is obviously bad, and it will increase your inflammatory markers in the bloodstream. There are other environmental factors, pollutants in the air and so forth, but probably the biggest single factor is your diet. And I'd like for you to forget everything you've ever learned about diet before, because it's very confusing. You've got the low-fat diet and the low-carb diet and the Atkins diet and the South Beach diet and the Mediterranean diet and the Paleolithic diet, and the list goes on and on and on. I want you to think about an anti-inflammatory diet. You're going to eat foods that decrease inflammation, and you're going to avoid those foods that increase inflammation. So what determines the inflammatory nature of a food? The first and most important thing is the type and the amount of fat. So it's not about low fat or high fat, it's about eating those fats that decrease inflammation and avoiding foods that promote inflammation. And probably the worst food in terms of promoting inflammation are the so-called trans fats. Now, trans fats were actually invented by food scientists in the 1970s with one goal in mind, and that was to increase the shelf life of the foods that they were put in. So you're stuck in a snowstorm, for example, and you reach under the seat and there's a Hostess Twinkie underneath there, and it's been there for 7 years and it looks the same as it did when you first purchased it. It's the trans fats that allow that increased shelf life. So trans fat should be avoided. Now here's one tip for you with regard to trans fats. Trans fats are also referred to as hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated oils. And now they only have to label it as containing trans fats if it's sold across state lines. So when you go to your local deli and you get a muffin, you need to learn to read the label. If it says hydrogenated oils, partially hydrogenated oils, avoid it. Trans fats are arguably one of the worst things you can eat, and they're very pro-inflammatory. The other fat that you want to avoid are the saturated fats as found in animal fats. The good fats that you want to have more of would be the omega-3 fatty acids or fish oils, and olive oil, for example, is a very good fat to have. So avoid saturated fats and trans fats, which are pro-inflammatory. Increase your intake of omega-3 fatty acids and the omega-9 fatty acid olive oil. The second thing that determines the inflammatory nature of a food is the so-called glycemic index. So what's the glycemic index? The glycemic index tells you how quickly a food that you eat is converted to sugar. So when you ingest sugar or anything that's converted to sugar easily, like a white flour product, your blood sugar rises rapidly, and right behind it your insulin level rises rapidly in an attempt to lower the sugar. Insulin is very pro-inflammatory. So it's all about keeping your blood sugar and your insulin within a very narrow range. And that's why you'll see the glycemic index noted on certain foods. A glycemic index of 100 is sugar. You want something 50% of that or less. So the type and amount of fat, the glycemic index of a food, and then the third thing would be the phytonutrient content of a food, which is to say that some foods actually have potent antioxidant vitamins and minerals. So for example, your green leafy vegetables, kale, spinach, things like that have natural vitamins, if you will, antioxidants that will scavenge these so-called free radicals in the bloodstream that promote inflammation. So decrease trans fats and saturated fats, increase your intake of the anti-inflammatory good fats, your omega-3 fatty acids and omega-9 fatty acids. You want to decrease your intake of foods that have a very high glycemic index. You want to eat foods that have a lot of phytonutrients, natural vitamins and minerals. And then the last thing is certain foods actually contain natural anti-inflammatory compounds. Usually this is your spices and herbs. So for example, turmeric is very anti-inflammatory. Ginger's anti-inflammatory. You want to really spice your food up in an attempt to help decrease cellular inflammation. And if you'll just do those four things, decrease trans fats and saturated fats, increase the good fats, eat lots of vegetables, and avoid foods that have a high glycemic index, and then really season your food well with lots of spices. The last thing I'll say is the water can actually be bad for you. Some water, particularly bottled water, is actually acidic. It has a pH that's somewhat less than 7, usually in the 4 to 5 range. Acidity and inflammation go together. So when I talk about decreasing inflammation, we could talk about decreasing foods that make your body acidic. And it's important to just be aware of the fact that your water can have that unintended adverse effect. So know the pH of the water that you're going to drink if you're going to drink it on a regular basis. What we recommend for our patients is that they just drink filtered municipal water. You don't have to spend a lot of money. Get a simple filter, take your tap water, and get the chlorine and things like that out of there that you don't want. But you don't want to take everything out of the water. It's interesting when you look at pockets around the world, cultures around the world where they live to a ripe old age, there's two common denominators. One, they eat a plant-based diet grown on a very fertile soil, like an organic diet, if you will, and the water that they drink is a natural spring water that's got a lot of these good vitamins and minerals and lots of calcium and magnesium and things that our bodies really need. So forget everything you've heard about diet in the past. I mean, another way to think about it is this. Your diet should be mainly plant-based, preferably organic. When you add protein, add lean protein, which is low in saturated fat, whole fruit, and whole grains whenever possible.